It wasn't curiosity that brought me to St. Augustine's church. It was a feeling, a pull I couldn't ignore. For weeks, I had heard whispers about the church, how people who stepped inside were never the same. I didn't believe in that sort of thing. But one night, as if something was guiding me, I found myself standing in front of its doors. They were cracked and warped with age, but still solid. The air around the church felt wrong, heavy, like the building was breathing. I told myself I'd only take a quick look. When I stepped inside, the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of me. It was pitch black, but my flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a scene that stopped me cold. The pews were overturned and broken, and something was smeared across the altar, a dark stain that had soaked deep into the stone. But then, I heard it. A faint voice. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but the sound grew clearer. Words, low and guttural. My flashlight flickered, and I turned sharply toward the noise. "Is someone here?" I called out. Though my voice didn't carry far, no answer. I tried to convince myself it was in my head, just my nerves. But then, the voice said my name. Clearly, it was so close, as though someone stood right behind me. I spun around, the light shaking in my trembling hands. No one was there. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart pounded so loudly, I couldn't hear anything else until the whisper returned, louder this time, and all around me. A word I didn't understand, repeated over and over. My flashlight died, plunging me into complete darkness. The whisper turned into a growl, a chorus of growls. It sounded like dozens of voices speaking as one, crawling over each other in a terrible chant. I felt a presence in the dark, pressing against me, filling every corner of the room. "Leave," I managed to choke out. My voice was nothing compared to theirs. But then, the pews began to scrape across the floor. I couldn't see them, but I heard them, dragging slowly, as if something unseen moved them. The sound made my skin crawl, and the whispers turned into laughter. Deep, mocking, inhuman. I staggered backward until my hands hit the cold surface of the altar. My fingers brushed something sharp, a carving in the stone. I traced it in the dark, my breath hitching. It was a word. I couldn't see it, but somehow I knew what it said. My name. And beneath it, the word eternal. The church rumbled. A deep vibration that rattled my bones, and I heard the doors slam shut on their own. Something was coming closer. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing across the stone floor. I felt a cold breath against my ear, and a voice whispered, "Stay." That's when I screamed. I ran blindly, feeling the walls, the pews, until my hands found the door. It was locked. I slammed my fists against it, begging to be let out, until suddenly it gave way. I fell outside, gasping, the night air rushing into my lungs. When I looked back, the church was dark and silent again, as though nothing had happened. But the feeling hasn't left me since. That voice still echoes in my head when I'm alone. And sometimes, in the silence of night, I hear it again, whispering my name. When I first saw St. Lucian's Church, it was just a ruin, half a roof, crumbling walls, and a bell tower that leaned like it was ready to fall. The villagers said it had been abandoned for over a century. No one went near it anymore. Not since the incident, though no one dared to say what that was. I didn't go looking for trouble, I only passed by it during a drive through the countryside. But as I stopped to stretch my legs and stared at the decrepit church, I heard something strange. The bells were ringing. They were deep and solemn, like the toll for a funeral. I stood there for a long moment, watching the empty tower. The bells couldn't be ringing. There were no ropes, no people, no anything left inside that place. But then, I heard a second sound, like faint voices humming along with the bells. I should have driven away. I wanted to, but something drew me closer, an odd, irresistible pull. As I stepped inside through the broken doorframe, the light seemed to vanish behind me. The interior was worse than I imagined. The pews were split and rotted, the floor littered with broken hymnals and shattered glass from the stained windows. Yet, the humming was louder here. It came from the bell tower above, where I saw a set of old wooden stairs spiraling upward. I told myself I'd just take a look. Each step groaned under my weight as I climbed, the air thickening with every turn of the staircase. The humming grew clearer now, low voices, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like chanting. I stopped halfway up, heart pounding, as I thought I heard something breathing from above. But then, I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, nearly tumbling down the stairs. No one was there, but the air felt colder, heavier. The voices had stopped, the bells had stopped, only silence remained. I should have turned back, but something told me that if I didn't see what was up there, it wouldn't let me leave. When I reached the top of the tower, I froze. The bells were rusted, unmoving, yet the air vibrated like they had just rung. All around the circular room were dark stains on the stone floor, patterns that looked like symbols. At the center of it all stood a figure. It wasn't facing me, but I could see its outline, long-limbed, thin, almost skeletal, draped in black robes that shifted as though they were alive. It didn't move, but I felt it was aware of me, waiting. My throat went dry as I stepped backward. The wood creaked beneath my foot, and suddenly, the figure turned its head. There were no eyes, just a hollow void where a face should be. The chanting began again, but this time it came from inside my head. I stumbled backward, slamming against the railing, as the figure raised one hand toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body felt like it was being pulled apart, my mind cracking open like glass. Then, the bells began ringing again, louder, deafening, as if they were inside me. I don't know how I got out. I remember waking up on the grass outside the church at sunrise, my ears ringing and my shirt soaked in sweat. The bells were silent again, but when I turned back to look at the tower, the figure was there, just a shadow standing at the top, staring down at me. I drove away as fast as I could, but the sound of those bells never left me. Even now, in the dead of night, I hear them tolling, slow and heavy, like they're counting down to something. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that figure, waiting. I never wanted to enter that church, but when my grandmother passed, she left me a strange note. Find peace at St. Hilarious. The answers are in the light. St. Hilarious Church had been abandoned for decades. No one talked about it except in hushed, fearful voices. Some said a priest had gone mad there, others believed something darker resided within its walls. I didn't believe in curses, but my grandmother was the only family I had left. Her words weighed on me like an unfinished story. So one evening, just as the sun sank below the hills, I stood before the cracked stone doors of St. Hilarious. A chill wind slipped past me, as though the building exhaled. I hesitated, but then I pushed the doors open. The inside was suffocatingly dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the outline of the altar, carved stone with a massive stained glass window above it. The window depicted a scene one didn't recognize. Angels tangled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted in agony. It made me shiver. But then, I noticed something. There were eyes, not in the glass, but above the altar, embedded into the wall itself. Hundreds of them, carved deeply into the stone. I stepped closer. It must have been a trick of the light, but the eyes seemed to follow me. My skin prickled as I moved closer to the altar, drawn by something I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A low voice whispering from the darkness, just out of reach. Do you see it? I froze. My flashlight flickered, the beam trembling as much as my hands. Who's there? I whispered. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the air thickened, and the temperature dropped until I could see my breath. My flashlight suddenly flared to life, and I caught a glimpse of something crawling across the wall. Shadows. dozens of them, moving like spiders, clinging to the stone eyes. Then I looked up. The stone eyes above the altar were weeping. Black, oily tears dripped down the wall and pooled at its base. The whispers grew louder. A chorus now, each voice layered on the next, calling out words I didn't understand. The shadows spread, slithering down the walls and across the floor. I stumbled backward, but my legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself wanted to hold me there. And then I saw it. The tears at the base of the altar were moving, rising up and shaping into something human. A figure formed, tall and thin, its face completely smooth except for a single carved eye in the center of its forehead. It opened its mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a sound like stone grinding against stone. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure raised a long, clawed hand and pointed at me. "Do you see it?" The voices whispered again, louder now, echoing through the church. My flashlight exploded in my hand, plunging me into darkness. And in that blackness I felt something move against me, cold and dry, like fingers brushing my skin. I don't remember leaving the church. I woke up hours later on the stone steps outside, my body freezing and my head pounding. The doors of St. Hilaria's were closed again, but the whispers hadn't stopped. Now, wherever I go, I feel eyes on me, watching. In mirrors, in dark corners, I catch glimpses of shadows crawling along the walls. And every night, as I lie in bed, I hear that voice in my ear, soft and low. "Do you see it?" I'd been a church organist for years, and when I was hired to restore the organ at St. Virgil's, I thought it would be just another job. The church had been abandoned for over 50 years, left to rot. After the congregation suddenly vanished overnight, no one spoke of it, and I never asked why. I only cared about the music. The first time I stepped inside, the silence was suffocating. The pews were covered in dust, and the stained glass windows barely let any light in. The air felt thick, like the church held its breath. At the far end of the room, the organ loomed, its pipes stretching toward the vaulted ceiling like skeletal fingers. It was beautiful in a way I couldn't explain. But then, I noticed the choir loft. It was empty, yet the air around it seemed alive, like I wasn't alone. I ignored the unease and set to work. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened. I tuned the pipes, replaced the keys, and worked late into the evenings. But on the fourth night, as I packed up my tools, I heard it faint singing. It sounded like a choir, soft and distant, humming a hymn I'd never heard before. The notes hung in the air, perfectly in tune, but there was something off about them, something hollow and cold. I climbed up to the choir loft, expecting to find a radio or something else that could explain it, but there was nothing. The sound stopped as soon as I looked. I tried to laugh it off, but when I turned back toward the organ, the hymn began again, louder this time. And this time, I could hear voices, low, harmonic, and inhuman. They were singing words I didn't understand, but somehow I knew they weren't meant to be heard by human ears. I hurried to pack my things, but when I glanced at the organ, I froze. The keys were moving on their own. A single note rang out deep and vibrating, followed by another, and then another. The organ was playing itself. The hymn grew louder, the choir's voices swelling until it felt like they were all around me. I looked up toward the loft and saw them figures standing shoulder to shoulder, completely still, draped in tattered black robes. Their faces were shrouded, but I could feel them watching me. My legs refused to move as the music grew deafening. The figures began to sway, their movements jerky and unnatural, their song turning into a wail, a sound so low it rattled my chest. Then I saw the organ pipes. Black liquid was seeping from them, dripping onto the floor. The pipes groaned and twisted like they were alive. The choir's wailing turned into screams, and I felt something cold clutch my wrist. I yanked myself free and ran, the sound chasing me as I stumbled out of the church and into the night. The music stopped the moment I crossed the threshold, leaving only silence behind me. I never went back, but St. Virgil's never let me go. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the hymn. It's growing louder, closer, like the choir is waiting for me to return. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear the organ playing, calling me back to finish what I started. It began on a Sunday evening, when Father Marcus called me to repair the confessional booth at St. Jude's Chapel. The church was old, forgotten by most, tucked away in a quiet forest clearing. Father Marcus said the booth door wouldn't stay shut, and the wood sounded hollow, like something was inside it. I didn't think much of it. Churches always had a way of feeling haunted, even when they weren't. When I arrived, the chapel was dark except for the faint glow of candles at the altar. Father Marcus was nowhere to be seen. "Father," I called, but my voice was swallowed by the stillness. The confessional sat at the far end of the chapel, an ancient, heavy wooden box. The left door, the priest's side, creaked open as though it were inviting me in. I stepped closer, running my hand over the wood. It felt warm, almost alive. I reached for the door to check the hinges, but then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from inside the booth. "Forgive me." I froze. It was quiet, like someone murmuring just beneath their breath. I knocked on the confessional. "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. I crouched to inspect the hinges, but the whisper returned. Louder this time. "Forgive me." It wasn't coming from a person. It was coming through the wood, as though the booth itself was speaking. I stepped back, my heart thundering in my chest, when the right side door where the sinner would sit slowly swung open on its own. I stared into the darkness. The seat inside looked normal, but something about the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, like they stretched into an unseen void. A chill ran through me as the whisper grew louder and clearer. "Forgive me, for I have sinned." I backed away, but then something moved inside the booth. A shape, a shadow, crawled up the walls, shifting like smoke but with purpose. 2 points of light appeared where eyes should have been, staring at me from the darkness. My legs refused to move. The shadow grew, spilling out of the booth like ink spreading across the floor. The air grew heavy, and the chapel felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. "Forgive me," the voice repeated, but it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was low, guttural, and layered, like 100 voices speaking at once. The shadow stretched toward me, curling like claws along the floor. I finally turned and bolted for the door. My shoes slipped against the old stone, but I didn't look back. I burst into the night air, gasping, as the chapel door slammed shut behind me. The next morning, I called Father Marcus, but he didn't answer. When I returned to the chapel with the local caretaker, the confessional was gone. The booth, the shadows, everything gone, as if it had never existed. But I know it was real. That voice still follows me. At night, when I close my eyes, I hear it murmuring just behind me. "Forgive me, for I have sinned." And sometimes, in the corner of my room, I see it. The shadow waiting in the dark, 2 faint lights glowing where its eyes should be. Growing up, I often visited my cousin's small town during summer breaks. It was a quiet place with little more than rolling fields and an ancient church that loomed at the edge of town. St. Matthias, they called it. Everyone avoided it, but no one ever explained why. One sweltering evening, bored out of our minds, my cousin Mark and I decided to explore it. "The church has a back door that never locks," he said with a grin. "Bet no one's been inside for years." I didn't argue. We snuck out just as the sun dipped below the hills. By the time we reached St. Matthias, the air felt different, colder, though the heat of the day still clung to my skin. The church sat in silence, its spire crooked against the darkening sky. We slipped in through the back door. The air was thick with dust and the faint, sour smell of decay. Moonlight streamed through the broken windows, casting strange shadows across the pews. For a place abandoned so long, it felt alive. That's when I noticed him. At the far end of the church, standing by the altar, was a man. His back was to us, dressed in tattered black robes that seemed to shift like smoke. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. "Who's that?" I whispered. Mark didn't answer. I glanced over and saw his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We should go," he muttered. But then, the man turned. His face was wrong, pale and smooth, like wax stretched too thin. 2 hollow holes sat where his eyes should have been, black as coal and bottomless. "Do you see me?" the man whispered. The words came from everywhere at once, low, rasping, and layered like dozens of voices speaking together. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as if something heavy was pressing down on me. The man began to walk toward us, though his feet made no sound. The closer he came, the colder the air grew, until I could see my breath. Mark grabbed my arm and yanked me back. "Run," he shouted. We bolted for the back door, but the church seemed endless now. The pews stretched on forever, and the man's voice echoed all around us. "You cannot leave." I never did. I looked back, and he was right behind us, though he didn't seem to move, just standing there, closer and closer with every blink. His mouth twisted into something like a smile, his hollow eyes locked on mine. The back door was finally in sight. We dove through it, falling into the grass outside, gasping for air. The man didn't follow, but when I looked back, I saw his figure standing just inside the doorway, watching us. "Do you see me?" he whispered again, though his voice was in my head now. Mark and I never spoke about that night, not to each other, not to anyone. But weeks later, he started acting strange, distant, sleepless. One morning, his mother found him sitting at the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, whispering the same thing over and over. "Do you see me? Do you see me?" When I visited him in the hospital, he didn't even look at me. But in his pale reflection on the window, I swear I saw someone else standing behind him. A man in black robes. And every now and then, in the quiet of night, I hear it too. Soft, faint, just behind my ear. "Do you see me?" I grew up in a deeply religious family, and my Uncle Peter was the most devout of all. A quiet man, he spent his life as a caretaker for a remote church, St. Livius, a small, crumbling place no one visited anymore. "God's house must never be empty," he used to say. Then, one day, he stopped coming home. My father sent me to check on him, saying Uncle Peter must have gotten carried away with his duties. St. Livius sat on a lonely hill, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to reach for the sky like clawed hands. As I stepped inside, the stale air hit me like a wall. Cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell I couldn't place. I found him kneeling at the altar. At first glance, he looked like he was praying, but something was off. His body was rigid, his hands clasped so tightly they'd gone white. His face was turned up toward the cross, his mouth moving silently. "Uncle Peter," I said. My voice echoed unnaturally loud in the empty space. He didn't respond. I moved closer, my footsteps muffled by the dust on the stone floor. That's when I heard it. He was praying, but not in any language I'd ever heard. The words were harsh, guttural, like they scraped against his throat. "Uncle." I touched his shoulder, and his head snapped toward me so quickly I stumbled back. His eyes were wrong, black, bottomless, with no whites at all. His mouth moved faster, the words spilling out like a stream, louder now, as if they burned to be spoken. The air around him seemed to hum, vibrating with an unseen force. "Who are you talking to?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He only smiled, an unnatural, stretched grin that didn't belong on his face. I backed away, but as I did, I noticed something strange. His shadow, it didn't match his movements. As he knelt, the shadow stood towering against the altar wall, its arms outstretched like it was mocking the crucifix. It wasn't human. Its head was twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes were staring right at me. I ran to the door, but it slammed shut on its own. Behind me, I heard Uncle Peter's voice rise into a roar, a chorus of words in that same alien tongue, echoing like thunder in the empty church. I turned back just in time to see him rise. Levitating off the ground, his limbs contorted as if something inside him was trying to crawl out. "Help me," he rasped suddenly in his own voice. His black eyes flickered for just a moment, filled with terror. "Don't let it." But then, the other voice returned, loud and mocking, bursting from his mouth like it didn't belong. "This house is no longer empty." The stained glass windows shattered, shards raining down like colored knives. I threw myself at the door, screaming, and it finally gave way. I didn't stop running until the church was out of sight, the horrible sound still echoing in my ears. Uncle Peter was never found. The church was sealed up soon after, but it didn't matter. At night when the wind howls, I hear his voice, still praying, still trapped, the words pounding in my head like a curse. And sometimes in the corners of my room I see it, a shadow that doesn't belong to me, arms outstretched in silent triumph.